The Resident Evil franchise has found its way into the homes of tens of millions of players over the course of its 30-year history. From its early beginnings in the Spencer Mansion and Raccoon City, Capcom has made it so regardless of what platform you own, you can play a Resident Evil game. PlayStation, Xbox, PC, Nintendo, virtual reality, and even many more systems. There has always been a way for most gamers to experience a Resident Evil game. But what about those who don't have a console, or for people seeking a Resident Evil experience on the go in their pocket 24/7? One that's just ready to pick up and play at any time? Well, among developing many main and spin-off games for home consoles, Capcom also developed many Resident Evil games designed for mobile phones, allowing fans to play Resident Evil wherever, whenever. The history of Resident Evil games on mobile is more extensive than you may think. The first Resident Evil mobile game was released all the way back in 2001, which is just 5 years after the franchise was first created, by the way. As smartphone technology was developing rapidly from 2001 on, the history of Resident Evil mobile games is very strange and all over the place. I believe this corner of Resident Evil history holds some of the franchise's most interesting games, from both the fan and development side of things. With the rise of hybrid handheld systems with home console levels of graphics, such as the Nintendo Switch and Steam Deck, you may think that Resident Evil mobile games may not be as much of a focus for Capcom as it may have been 15 years ago, for example. But you would be wrong, as Capcom still sees mobile as a valued space for Resident Evil experiences. So, with this clearly long, messy, kinda unheard of history, where do you even begin to understand it all? Well, that's exactly what I'll be discussing in this video. I've broken down the entire history of Resident Evil mobile games into 3 eras/chapters. Chapter 1, the Experimental Era, Chapter 2, the Formative Era, and Chapter 3, the Standardized Era. Each of these eras shows not only developments in smartphone technology and the mobile games industry, but also Capcom's development with bringing Resident Evil to smartphones. I'll be examining each of these eras and the games Capcom released within them, analysing the highs and lows and how Capcom learned as a developer through their many mobile releases. Let me now bring you on a journey through what I believe to be one of the most fascinating periods in Resident Evil history, starting where it all began in Chapter 1, the Experimental Era. Chapter 1 marks the beginning of Capcom's venture into the mobile game space, and this era of Resident Evil mobile games has such a special charm to it. This era is pretty well encapsulated by my chosen title, as Capcom really didn't understand how exactly they wanted to bring Resident Evil to these tiny pocket devices, which led to some of the franchise's most wacky and odd releases. The Experimental Era would run from 2001 till around 2008/9. In those roughly 7 to 8 years, Capcom would release around 11 Resident Evil games for mobile and smartphone devices, most of which were developed by Capcom themselves, but a few were handled by other studios and just published by Capcom. It should also be said that since this era starts in 2001, Capcom was held back massively by phone technology of the time. The true modern smartphone you would come to think of, you know, the likes of one with a touchscreen and app store, wouldn't truly release until 2008. And I mean, going back just a few years prior to 2001, the infamous mobile game Snake was first released, which kinda puts into perspective how rapidly smartphone technology was developing. To kick things off, I present to you what is widely regarded as the first official Resident Evil mobile game. Biohazard iSurvivor would be the first Resident Evil mobile game ever. Released on June 4th, 2001, this first jab at the mobile game space for Resident Evil was actually developed by Living Mobile Games, a small German studio founded in that same year. Biohazard iSurvivor was developed for the 503i series of phones, which kept this game exclusive to Japan. The plot of Biohazard iSurvivor is really strange. This game follows the events of the first Resident Evil, but disregards RE2 and 3. Characters such as Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield, and Leon S. Kennedy are all featured here, but Claire Redfield and Ada Wong are absent, and instead there is 5 new STARS members added to this game. They were created solely for this release, and don't appear in any other form of Resident Evil media. First up is Frank, a marksman known for close range combat. Next is Kay, who's proficient at medium range engagements. Next is AI, who's a STARS sniper. Then we have Anna, who seems to be a Rebecca Chambers stand-in, as she is a STARS field medic. And finally, to round off our brand new STARS members, is Kentaro. He aids in technical support and exploration. As for the gameplay of iSurvivor, it seems to be all done through text events, that players then make choices on that will use their resources. Of the examples I have, this screen here shows the player finding a handgun, another shows a brief encounter with Jill Valentine, which seems to show her teaching the player how to create some sort of bomb. And here are 2 examples of the choice-based gameplay events. One shows the player finding a power plant, and the other a hospital. When presented with a new location like this, players can choose a few actions. All of these will take away a certain amount of the player's HP. For the power plant, it cost 8 HP to explore it, or alternatively 20 HP to go to a different location. There is also the option to take a break, which I assume means to do nothing. There is similar options for the hospital location. Enemy encounters also follow a similar choice system. This screen here shows a zombie horde encounter, with the listed choices being attack, run away, and 2 other options I'm not so sure about. From these battles, players gain XP that they can then use to upgrade 3 stats: attack, recovery, and discovery. As this is an internet-based game, iSurvivor takes advantage of that. Players are able to join together and form their own stars team. This acts kinda like a clan system common in modern mobile games. Players in a stars team together can share weapons, puzzle solutions, and health items to aid each other. New content would be added weekly via the internet. And sadly, as this was an always online sort of game, back in the early days of 2001, it was shut down on an unknown date from what I could find. Although its commercial page was taken down during April of 2009. Although I really doubt that this game was active from 2001 till 2009. And well, there seems to be no preserved files of this game from what I could gather online. Only these character sprites, logos, and screens. It's a real shame that this is the case, and that this game has been lost to time. It was the first Resident Evil mobile game to be released, and it's a quirky one at that. Well, from one strange RE game to another, let me show you what came next. Biohazard Zombie Buster is a top-down shooter that follows a flow reminiscent of Space Invaders. Enemies start at the top of the screen and make their way gradually to the bottom where the player is firing from. If they make contact with your character, you lose. Very simple, but easy to quickly pick up and play wherever. This game would also be released in 2001 like iSurvivor. However, unlike that game, it would make its way to audiences overseas in 2006. The gameplay of Zombie Buster is very pick up and play, which works great for the mobile environment. Players can choose to play as either Leon S. Kennedy or Claire Redfield. Leon has stronger attacks, whereas Claire attacks faster. Enemies descend from the top of the screen, down towards your chosen character. Killing enough enemies starts a boss fight. There are 3 bosses in total: a Tyrant, Yawn from RE1, and a bunch of crows. It seems like all these bosses are taken directly from Resident Evil 1, which is interesting given the RE2 character choices. After beating all the bosses, the game loops in on itself, with enemies getting faster and stronger. The game will continue like this until an enemy reaches Leon or Claire. Interestingly enough, Zombie Buster would get a remaster in 2011, with much improved sprites and artwork. And I really like this style. It's very Game Boy Advance-esque, and it's super cute. Sadly, this remaster was locked to Japan only. Released in 2002, Biohazard Assault the Nightmare is a first-person shooter of sorts. It sees players playing as a police officer. Although not explicitly named, it's believed that you play as Chris Redfield. Players explore a decrepit mansion after the local police force received an SOS signal from the location. And with this release, we kinda have a very linear version of a true Resident Evil experience for the first time on mobile. While exploring this mansion, you'll fight zombies, along with looking around for puzzle items and resources. This game even features a variety of weapons, typical in a normal RE game. A handgun, shotgun, submachine gun, and even grenade launcher. After exploring the mansion enough, players can unlock a corridor which holds a licker, which acts as this game's final boss. Defeating the licker gives players one of a few endings. With the player rescuing the survivor and leaving, the difference in ending comes in what the survivor is. It can be a man, woman, a pair of children, or even a dog. While Assault the Nightmare did initially launch in Japan as a part of Capcom's Party monthly subscription, it would go overseas to international fans in 2004. Biohazard The Missions released in 2003 in Japan and then launched in the US in 2006. It's a short and sweet mobile release. It doesn't aim to create any narrative, but is however a very easy game to pick up and play for a few minutes. Hence its subtitle, the game has players go through about 100 bite-sized missions, all set during the outbreak in Raccoon City. The game reuses a lot of assets, primarily backgrounds, from the PlayStation 1 era of games. During these missions, players take control of Jill Valentine, although other characters can be unlocked through gameplay. For the game's missions, they are very simple in their gameplay. These missions will have you defeating enemies, gathering supplies, solving puzzles, sneaking around, and doing stuff you typically do in an RE game. The game's missions are done in a branching system. Typically beating one mission doesn't just unlock the next one, instead multiple open up to you, allowing players more freedom over what they want to tackle next. And so far for the time period, Capcom have been doing an alright job with bringing Resident Evil to mobile in some way. With these smaller bite-sized games like Zombie Buster and The Missions, they didn't aim to be exactly like the home console releases. Instead, they embraced what mobile gaming is, quick on-the-go fun, even with the likes of Assault the Nightmare, which is kinda like a distant cousin to a true Resident Evil game. However, Capcom would start to get more confident and try to bring a closer experience to home console Resident Evil games to mobile users. While Capcom had already made several different kinds of games for mobile, this next one would actually spawn its own mini-series. Resident Evil Confidential Report File, man that's a mouthful, was released in Japan in 2003, and then later on, both the US and Europe would get the game in 2006. This game does its own thing for both gameplay and story. For its gameplay, we see a turn-based gameplay system, with the player moving one move at a time. Attacking enemies is done via this grid-based system. It features typical survival horror game design. Explore the environment, fight enemies, and search for supplies and resources. But of course, its gameplay is very different compared to normal Resident Evil games. Through the environment, you come across many different kinds of bioweapons, from RE0 all the way up to Resident Evil 3. You even face off against human enemies, which I would presume to be Umbrella's soldiers. For its narrative, Confidential Report File introduces 2 new protagonists players can choose from, although it may seem to those familiar with RE2 that they took some inspiration from that game's cast. Our first playable protagonist is Tyler Hamilton, a rookie cop who just joined the force, which sounds oddly similar to a certain Mr. Kennedy. Along with Tyler, there is also Naomi McLean, an FBI agent sent in to investigate Umbrella's research and experiments, which sounds very alike a certain Mrs. Wong, or at least Ada Wong's fake story that she tells Leon. Both Tyler and Naomi cross paths multiple times throughout the game's story, although the story itself isn't really prominent while playing. I mentioned earlier that Confidential Report File became its own miniseries, and that's correct, as a grand total of 3 other games were released. They all seemed to follow Tyler and Naomi, as they venture through more danger, although specific details are scarce. They all also seem to have released in 2006. However, I've seen sources cite 2005 as the second game's release year. And these sequels are not very different games gameplay wise either, just kinda more of the same isometric turn-based kinda gameplay. But for what they are, and for how limited the technology was, 4 games that take place in and around the Raccoon City incident is a pretty cool little oddity of a miniseries. You can see here what I talked about earlier. Capcom was getting closer and closer to bringing larger Resident Evil experiences to mobile phones. Confidential Report File had nearly every aspect of a home console game, just a bit different gameplay wise. Resident Evil Genesis continues Capcom's trend in trying to bring as close of a console experience to mobile devices, and this time they got really close to achieving that. Released in 2008, Resident Evil Genesis acts as a remake/retelling of RE1 Remake's story, with some alterations. Chris Redfield is completely omitted from this game. Instead, the Spencer Mansion incident plays out with Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, and Albert Wesker. Chris isn't even mentioned, which is an odd change to make. Gameplay for RE Genesis follows a lot of the norms you would expect from RE1. Players explore the Spencer Mansion, looking for supplies, puzzle items, all while taking out zombies. Due to constraints of the time, the Spencer Mansion had its layout altered a fair amount, although it does follow the same kind of flow as you would expect, exploring the main hall, dining room, caves, lab, and so on. Combat is very interesting here. When entering a room with enemies, Jill will instantly go into attack mode. Players will remain like this until the room is cleared of hostiles. When fighting an enemy, a small meter bar will appear. Players have to watch this meter and press the action button at the right time to have better accuracy on their shots. The player is able to miss, hit a body shot, or headshot if they time it right. Headshots of course deal much more damage. RE Genesis is a really strange oddity, as it's remarkably close to a home console game, all while still being built and made for smartphone devices. And we would see more like this game with the next mobile release from Capcom. Resident Evil Uprising released in 2009 and built off of RE Genesis. It adapts the story of Resident Evil 2 and features similar gameplay to that of Genesis. And much like Genesis, Uprising has some weird story changes. Players start the game as Claire Redfield, searching for her brother Chris Redfield, who, like I said, wasn't even present at all in Genesis. She runs into rookie cop Leon S. Kennedy. She decides to team up with Leon and search for her brother, all while trying to figure out what is going on in the city. However, unlike the original RE2, many characters are absent. Robert Kendo, Marvin Brannigan, and Ada Wong were all cut and don't make any appearance, nor does Mr. X. And that is most likely due to Leon and Claire sticking together instead of splitting up. This game only has one set campaign, unlike the game it's adapting. And speaking on that, the zapping system seen in Resident Evil 0 is used here, with players being able to swap between Claire and Leon on the fly. However, the other character you're not playing as isn't AI controlled, so they will just stand in place. There is some nice improvements in the gameplay department on from Genesis, with a new auto-aim feature making it much easier to fight enemies, although you can make use of the other game's aiming system if you would so like. Graphics and sprite work is also much improved over Genesis, and in general, like Genesis, it has the same gameplay flow: explore environments, fight enemies, and solve puzzles. I find both of these games such weird little oddities, because they are technically both another version of RE1 and 2. There technically being 3 versions of both games is a fun little fact to me, and well, this would be as far as Capcom could push Resident Evil games on mobile for this era. The experimental era is exactly that, A lot of the games I have discussed are weird offshoots from the main games, or do their own thing completely. Earlier games in this period were very much just fun, dumb mobile games, easy to just pick up and play for a while and then forget about. But as smartphone technology developed, Capcom was able to bring closer and closer renditions of Resident Evil to phones. Comparing a game early in this era, such as Zombie Buster, to something like Resident Evil Uprising, the difference is massive. And while I find this chapter in Resident Evil history to be just so interesting, this next one is where we would truly see Resident Evil come to smartphones. A full Resident Evil experience in your pocket on the go was a dream come true for many fans. And well, this marks the start of Chapter 2, the Formative Era. This era of Resident Evil mobile games will begin in 2008/9 and end recently enough in about 2023. The Formative Era gets its name from Capcom finally being able to fully bring Resident Evil games to mobile phones. The experimental era would come to a close in 2008 when this new era would begin, and the first release to start off this new era would be a port of one of Capcom's biggest Resident Evil games ever. With Apple unveiling the iPhone in 2007 and then the iPhone 3G in 2008, which then introduced the Apple App Store, this would be revolutionary for the mobile games market. In their previous era, Capcom had to rely on network-specific phones or weird online subscription plans in order to distribute their games. Now for users to get new software, they could simply go onto the App Store and download it, and the world went crazy for Apple's newest invention. This would be the first true modern-day smartphone that everyone had to have. And in 2008, Capcom would release Resident Evil 4 Mobile Edition, in Japan only. However, a year later in 2009, it would launch worldwide on the Apple App Store. This was huge for Capcom and the mobile game space. A full, albeit heavily cut back, port of one of the most popular Resident Evil titles ever had finally found its way into people's pockets. After 8 years of trying, Capcom finally had a full console release on the go. However, it had its rough parts. Much of RE4 Mobile is watered down compared to the original game. A lot of the game's cutscenes are absent. Instead, the game's story is told through slideshows with images and text. Although there are actually some cutscenes present, albeit at a very low resolution. Generally, a lot of RE4 is still present. You go through the village, castle and island, fighting Ganados and other enemies, all while trying to save the president's daughter, Ashley. Gameplay is largely the same, albeit with touchscreen controls. You shoot enemies, hitting their weak points lines them up for a roundhouse kick. Enemies also drop items as you would expect, which is all standard RE4 gameplay. However, the attaché case is noticeably missing. Leon's inventory, although it's called an attaché case, is instead displayed via this plain vertical menu, unlike the iconic inventory system seen in the original game. And well, it's kinda hard to ignore, so I have to mention this game's graphics, or the lack thereof. Look, for an iPhone game in 2009, it looks like RE4 if you halved every asset's resolution and polygon count twice. Sound effects are rather low quality and crunchy, models are sharp and pointy, and it doesn't run the smoothest. But I can forgive all that simply because it exists and works. It's really impressive that a game that launched in 2005 on home consoles could run on a smartphone just 4 years later. While it is such a strange port that has been scaled down massively, you had a port of one of the greatest Resident Evil games ever in your pocket 24/7 on the go. Although not a good way to play RE4, it was still a way to play it, and this port of RE4 would serve as the bones for Capcom's next release in this era. In 2009, to tie in with the CGI movie of the same name, Capcom released Resident Evil Degeneration, a small little RE4 clone of sorts, all just to promote the CGI movie. And this is such an odd little release to me. It was the only Resident Evil game ever made to tie in with any movie or other media form. RE Degeneration was the second Resident Evil game to release on iPhone, following RE4 Mobile. And if you played one, you kinda played the other in a gameplay sense. There was a lot of reused content between the games. RE Degeneration features a lot of the animations from RE4 Mobile, along with the exact same movement style and control scheme. In this game, Leon actually talks to Hunnigan via the radio, which is exactly like RE4. The game is split into 11 chapters, and actually has in-engine cutscenes, and while they are pretty rough and they sorely lack voice acting, it's still a big improvement over the text and images RE4 Mobile had. And as well as that, the game's intro actually features footage from the movie, just massively scaled down. You can even come across a merchant, much like RE4, and I find it funny that for this quick little tie-in game, Capcom basically just did RE4 again, especially in the gameplay department. You fight enemies, they drop items, you search for puzzle items, and face off against bosses and such. A funny little change here as well is that enemies drop US dollars instead of pesetas. I do find the location of the airport to be an interesting one, and while I'm still yet to watch RE Degeneration, it's so cool to see I have a tie-in game. Due to its smaller scale overall, this game runs much smoother and has higher quality models and textures compared to RE4 Mobile. And of course, like I said, it features in-engine cutscenes. On from the generation and RE4 Mobile, Capcom would shortly release yet another full RE game, but in a different way. After having 2 full Resident Evil releases, Capcom chose to forego doing another one, but still wanted to reuse the work they'd already done with RE4 Mobile and the generation. This is where Resident Evil Mercenaries Versus comes into the picture. Released in April of 2011 for the Apple ecosystem, this was a full game that was comprised of the Mercenary side mode seen in many of the home console RE games. Although it's a bit of a mishmash of RE games. There are 3 characters players can choose from here: Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and Albert Wesker, all of which appear as their RE5 versions. And on the contrary, the enemies you face are all from RE4. The same goes for the locations we fight in. I'd assume reusing enemy and environmental assets from RE4 Mobile was much easier than creating low quality versions of RE5 environments and creatures. Still, I do find this an interesting choice. The gameplay follows the Mercenaries gameplay style you should be expecting by now. Defeat enemies till the timer runs out, all while racking up a high score. Defeating many enemies in rapid succession starts a combo chain. Keep this combo up for an even higher score. Although, you are able to play against other real players as you compete for the top spot. When facing off against other players, you can choose to just go after them outright instead of trying to kill AI. Player models and assets look generally like you would expect for an RE game on mobile. However, the player models in particular stand out as being very detailed, especially when compared to the RE4 mobile creatures also seen in this game, which sorely needed an update. I find that Mercenaries works even better for mobile devices compared to something like RE4 Mobile. Since Mercenaries is far more arcadey, it's easy to just quickly pick up and play for a few minutes and then put back down. And I think this is one of Capcom's better moves in their mobile games effort. I only wish there was more characters and levels than there was. With those 3 releases up, we mostly come to the end of Capcom's second era of mobile games. The last main game they would release would be Biohazard Outbreak Survive, which was a complete 180 compared to all the other releases this generation. Released in 2011 for iPhones, it was marketed as a social survival horror game, and honestly, it's a bit like Biohazard iSurvivor from all the way back in 2001. Biohazard Outbreak Survive did gain some popularity, surpassing 2 million users in just over a year. It would regularly see new content updates and events. Gameplay had players completing missions, unlocking new characters, and sending friends over items if they needed. However, in May of 2015, the game would cease to exist, either due to low player counts or a lack of interest from Capcom at the time. While another cool little oddity, it was very different from the prior 3 games in this period, and it echoed back to something from the earlier experimental era. I see this as Capcom finally being able to do what they wanted with iSurvivor. However, the idea as a whole has limited interest. There would be some very other small releases in this era, but I feel they don't really deserve their own section. So to conclude this chapter, the Formative Era was very important for Capcom and the mobile game space, with 3 pretty big releases. Bringing Resident Evil games to smartphones was a huge accomplishment, and Capcom really shaped what they wanted to do with Resident Evil on the go. The next and final chapter will be far more standard, with no wacky releases, but it does still feel important to talk about the current era of Resident Evil on smartphone, which leads us to Chapter 3, the Standardized Era. It seems to be a trend that whenever smartphone technology evolves, a new era of Resident Evil on smartphones begins. First with early 2000s smartphones, then with late 2000s iPhone, and now the standardized era will begin due to Apple's iPhone 15 Pro and M1 chip range of hardware. It's unclear if Apple wanted to promote the power of their new hardware and reached out to Capcom, or if Capcom simply wanted to have Resident Evil on mobile devices again. With this new hardware, Capcom would begin porting all of their modern Resident Evil games to the new Apple iPhones. And in a strange choice of order, Resident Evil Village was announced to be releasing in October of 2023. Just 2 months later, Resident Evil 4 Remake would release also. It seems like Capcom was releasing the most recent RE games first. Then in June of 2024, both Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 2 Remake were announced to be taking the jump to mobile. All of these mobile ports came with improvements such as an auto fire feature to better suit mobile play. Although these games had those full touchscreen controls like RE4 Mobile had before it, a secondary controller was recommended for the best user experience by Capcom. When they released, many users thought it was really novel to have a full copy of Resident Evil 7, 8, 2 and 4 Remake in their pocket. However, this wasn't without setbacks. Battery drain was huge while running these games, and if I remember correctly, overheating problems weren't uncommon, or at a minimum, your phone would get very hot. Another issue with bringing these home console releases to mobile, there can be a lot happening at once in any of these games, and with touchscreen controls, your fingers will be taking up majority of the screen, and things just start to get all sorts of cramped. And you may say, why not just use the controller? Well then that defeats the whole purpose of mobile on-the-go gaming. If I need to bring a spare controller with me outside, it forgoes all sorts of portability. Looking past these complaints and issues, these were mostly fine full versions of RE2 Remake, 7, 8 and 4 Remake. Then RE3 Remake would finally be making the jump to mobile, as recent as March of 2025, and you can expect more of the same pros and cons here as the other releases. It was definitely odd how long it took RE3 to come to mobile specifically. I suppose it wasn't a high priority for Capcom. Overall, these ports were cool, but they didn't make much of a splash. I think people are kinda over high fidelity games on mobile, and with the issues these ports have, I think that many people just steered clear. Although, the final release I want to talk about today feels much better suited for mobile play. Resident Evil Survival Unit is the most recent Resident Evil mobile game. Announced earlier in 2025, it would fully launch worldwide in November of the same year. This will be developed by Joy City Corporation and overseen by Capcom themselves. And this release kinda came out of nowhere. And I have actually played this one a fair amount myself. And I must say, I find it fun and addictive. Resident Evil Survival Unit is a mishmash of a lot of popular modern smartphone games. This game is laid out like this. The first component is this base builder game, similar to the likes of Clash of Clans. You will level up your buildings, gain more and more supplies, and unlock new abilities. Next, there is the campaign component, which features this tower defense sort of gameplay. You choose a squad of characters and have them fight off against waves of enemies, all while using their unique abilities to help them survive. And how exactly do we gain new characters? Well, that's the next piece of this puzzle. In order to obtain new characters, you must do gacha rolls and gamble for them. While I don't love this system, overall it feels like the game is generous with rewards and login bonuses, so I don't mind it so much. Finally, the last main component will be the exploration sections. These feel way more Resident Evil than anything else here. While you unlock new buildings in the base builder section, often you'll be able to go inside them as the player character and explore around, completing classic Resident Evil style puzzles and taking down zombies with limited resources. And for a game that's mishmashed together and released out of nowhere, it works surprisingly well. Having all these different gameplay components makes it so you don't get tired of the game so easy, and I find upgrading my base and characters to be addicting. As for this game's narrative, however, it starts as an offshoot of the events of Raccoon City. We play as this unnamed character, who I guess is this big main character in this game's narrative. Through the story, you'll meet familiar faces like Marvin Brannigan and Jill Valentine, and there is also new characters introduced. But to be honest, I wasn't paying the most amount of attention to this game's narrative. So far, there hasn't been too much post-launch content, although I have seen there is plans to support this game into the future, and I hope we see that. I think Resident Evil Survival Unit is a fun enough game to pass the time when bored, and I feel it's a very fitting game to end off this entire video. Resident Evil Survival Unit kinda encapsulates this era well. This game was engineered from the ground up to be a fun mobile game first, Resident Evil game second. It pulls ideas and gameplay mechanics from some of the biggest mobile games out there, and then just puts a Resident Evil coat of paint over it. And well, the standardized era of Resident Evil mobile games kinda ends here. This era is very boring and just whatever in my opinion. Sure, it works, but it doesn't have the intrigue or uniqueness the experimental era had, or even the wow factor seen in the Formative Era. When Resident Evil first came to mobile phones, it was this huge wow no way sort of feeling, but now with literally every modern RE game available in your pocket, it just doesn't have the same charm to it. And while I do like Survival Unit, it's not half as wacky as some of the other games before it. I don't hate this era though, it kinda feels right in a way. This chapter perfectly mixes all the lessons Capcom has learned in the past 20 years that they've been trying to bring Resident Evil to mobile phones. The lessons in the experimental and formative era is what makes up this standard chapter, and well, seeing Capcom evolve from the early 2000s to now, it has been a very interesting chapter in Resident Evil history. While we now draw to the end of Resident Evil mobile games history, I'm sure there will be more releases in the coming years. Capcom still clearly values the mobile market, so we shall see in the next few years if a new chapter emerges. I had a ton of fun researching for this video. I haven't seen this era as a whole well documented anywhere, to be honest. So I hope I provided you with a detailed summary of this strange part of Resident Evil history. And it's actually funny how this lines up with the franchise's 30th birthday. If you did enjoy this video and want to see more Resident Evil history stuff and survival horror content as a whole, make sure you subscribe to me and let me know down below what did you think of the history of Resident Evil mobile games. What was your favourite chapter and what was your favourite game? Me personally, I think I like the Formative Era most, simply due to games like RE3 Generation and RE4 Mobile being so cool to see exist. Anyways, I have been talking for way too long. I want to thank you so very much for watching this video, and I will hopefully see you on my next one. Peace.